Kessa was 4 years old when the refugee transport carrying what remained of the Vesic colony crashed into a Kansas wheat field, and she was the only survivor pulled alive from the wreckage by a volunteer fire crew who had no protocol whatsoever for what to do with a small, silver-skinned child speaking a language none of their translators could parse. 12 years later, the Vesic Compact sent a formal diplomatic delegation to reclaim her, and Kessa stood in a courtroom in Topeka and told them, in flawless English, that she wasn't going anywhere. The crash had killed everyone else aboard, 41 Vesic refugees fleeing a border conflict that had, within days of the transport's destruction, become entirely irrelevant to the specific, immediate question of what should happen to the sole survivor. Kansas Child Protective Services, facing a situation no existing policy had ever anticipated, made an emergency placement decision within 72 hours, transferring custody of the unidentified alien child to Robert and Diane Foster, a couple who had already fostered 11 children across their considerable years of state certification, and who approached Kessa's arrival with the same practical, unhurried care they had extended to every child who had ever passed through their home. "We didn't know what she was, not really, not for those first few weeks," Diane Foster would later explain, during formal testimony that would eventually become part of the extensive legal record surrounding what the media would come to call the foster custody case. "We knew she was terrified and hurt and alone, and that she needed somebody to make sure she felt safe while everybody smarter than us figured out the bigger questions. So that's what we did. We didn't wait for permission to love her properly. We just did what we do for every kid who ends up in our house." Kessa's integration into human society, documented extensively across the following 12 years by researchers, journalists, and eventually diplomatic historians studying what would become one of the most significant cross-species custody cases in the early years of human-Vesic contact, proceeded with a completeness that surprised even the child psychologists initially assigned to monitor her development. She learned English within 8 months, developed close friendships with the foster family's other foster and adopted children, and by the time formal Vesic diplomatic contact with Earth was established 4 years after the crash, a contact that inevitably raised the question of what should happen to the one surviving Vesic citizen known to be living on human soil, Kessa Foster, as she had by then formally become through adoption proceedings finalized in her 2nd year with the family, considered herself, without qualification, a member of the foster family and by extension a human. The Vesic Compact's formal claim, submitted through diplomatic channels 8 years into Kessa's residence with the foster family, asserted what Vesic cultural and legal tradition considered an uncontestable biological and cultural right to reclaim a citizen born of Vesic parentage, regardless of the specific circumstances that had separated her from her original civilization. Vesic law recognizes no mechanism by which a child of Vesic parentage can be permanently separated from Vesic cultural custody, explained Ambassador Threl Asvani, presenting the Compact's formal claim during an early diplomatic session that Kessa, then 12 years old, was permitted to observe but not yet participate in directly. The child in question was placed with human caretakers as an emergency measure following a tragedy that eliminated any Vesic authority capable of properly determining her care at the time. This emergency circumstance does not constitute, under any Vesic legal framework, a permanent transfer of cultural or familial custody. We formally request the child's return to Vesic custody, to be raised within her own species' cultural tradition, among relatives who have, upon learning of her survival, expressed genuine and considerable desire to welcome her home. The claim, which generated immediate and extensive human legal and diplomatic complication, given the complete absence of any prior legal framework governing custody disputes between human and alien parties, would eventually require 4 years of complex litigation and diplomatic negotiation to resolve, a process that Kessa herself, as she grew older, increasingly insisted on participating indirectly, rather than allowing to proceed as an abstract legal question, decided entirely by adults on her behalf. "I want to understand something," she said, during a formal hearing convened when she was 14 years old, addressing Ambassador Asvani directly with a directness that several observers noted bore considerable resemblance to the particular blunt clarity her adoptive father Robert Foster brought to most difficult conversations. "You keep saying I belong to the Vesic Compact because of biology, because my parents were Vesic before they died in that crash. I understand that's true, in the sense that it's a fact about where I came from. But I don't understand why that fact is supposed to matter more than every other fact about who I actually am now. I don't speak Vesic anymore, not really, not beyond a few words I've picked up studying it specifically for these hearings. I don't know Vesic culture except from books and recordings your delegation has shown me. Everything I actually am, every memory I actually have that means something to me, happened here, with the Fosters in Kansas. I don't think biology gets to override 12 years of an actual life just because it happened first." Ambassador Asvani, whose considerable diplomatic experience had prepared him for a range of possible human legal and emotional arguments, but genuinely not for the specific, direct challenge of negotiating custody with the child in question herself, offered a response that reflected the genuine complexity of the compact's own cultural position, rather than simple diplomatic deflection. "I understand that everything meaningful in your conscious experience has occurred within human society," he said. "I do not dismiss that reality, Kessa, nor do I believe the relationships you have built with your human family are somehow illegitimate simply because they emerged from tragic and unusual circumstances. But I ask you to consider something our own cultural tradition holds to be genuinely important, even if your current experience has not yet taught you to value it the way our people do. You are, biologically and genetically, entirely Vesic. There are physiological and psychological aspects of Vesic identity that human society, however loving and well-intentioned, simply cannot provide you access to. Aspects of your own nature that you may not yet fully understand precisely, because you have never had the opportunity to develop within a community of your own actual species. Our request is not born of indifference to your human relationships. It is born of genuine concern that you may be missing something essential about your own nature that no amount of human love, however genuine, can fully substitute for. The case's eventual resolution, reached through a combination of extensive legal proceedings and, ultimately, a diplomatic compromise that would become foundational precedent for subsequent human-alien custody disputes across the following decades, hinged substantially on testimony that Kessa herself delivered during the case's final formal hearing, testimony that Diane Foster would later describe as the moment she understood, with complete certainty, that whatever legal outcome eventually emerged, her daughter had already answered the actual question that mattered most. "I've thought about this more than probably any 16-year-old should have to think about something this big," Kessa said, addressing the assembled panel of human judges and Vesic diplomatic representatives with a composure that belied the genuine weight of the question she had spent 4 years being asked to answer. "I know I'm Vesic. I've never pretended otherwise, and I don't think anybody in my family has ever asked me to pretend otherwise either. My mom and dad, Robert and Diane, they made sure I always knew the truth about where I came from, even when I was little, and it probably would have been easier in some ways to just let me grow up thinking I was human like everybody else around me. They didn't do that because they wanted to keep some kind of door open for the Vesic Compact to eventually walk through and take me back. They did it because they believed I deserved to know the truth about myself. And I think that tells you something important about what kind of family they actually are, even though the compact keeps suggesting they're somehow keeping me from something essential. I don't think knowing where I biologically came from and choosing where I actually belong are supposed to be the same decision," she continued. "I think you're allowed to know you're Vesic, and even care about that, and still decide that the people who showed up for you every single day for 12 years, who learned an entire alien language just so they could talk to a terrified 4-year-old who just lost everyone she'd ever known, who never once made me feel like I was some kind of complicated legal or diplomatic problem instead of just their daughter, that those people are actually my family, in every way that matters to me. I'm not rejecting being Vesic. I'm just telling you that being Vesic isn't the only thing about me that's real, and it's not the thing that gets to decide, all by itself, where I actually belong. The formal ruling, issued 6 weeks after Kessa's testimony, and eventually incorporated as foundational precedent into what would become known across subsequent decades as the Foster Standard governing human-alien custody determinations, established a legal framework that balanced biological and cultural heritage claims against the demonstrated, lived reality of a child's actual developed relationships and self-determined identity, weighted critically by the child's own expressed wishes. Once they reached an age the ruling defined as sufficient for genuine, informed self-determination. This court does not dismiss the Vesic Compact's genuine cultural interest in this child's heritage, the presiding judge wrote, in the ruling's formal opinion. Nor do we dismiss the Compact's evident sincerity in believing that reconnection with her biological species community would serve her well-being. But this court finds that 12 years of demonstrated functional family relationship, combined with a now 16-year-old child's clearly articulated, consistently maintained preference to remain within that relationship, constitutes a legal and moral claim that biological heritage alone, however significant, cannot override. Custody, this court finds, is ultimately a question of demonstrated care and chosen belonging, not merely genetic origin, and this child has demonstrated, with a clarity few adults in similar proceedings ever manage, exactly where she believes that belonging actually resides. The Vesic Compact, while formally accepting the ruling's outcome as a necessary diplomatic concession, given the broader relationship's continued strategic importance, negotiated, as part of the case's final resolution, ongoing cultural access arrangements that would allow Kessa continued, voluntary contact with Vesic cultural representatives, and eventually, extended family members who had survived the original conflict that claimed her birth parents. An arrangement Kessa herself embraced with genuine enthusiasm, once the pressure of potential forced relocation had been formally removed from the equation. I actually really wanted to know more about where I came from, once nobody was trying to make me choose between that and my actual family, she said, during an interview conducted several years after the case's formal conclusion. By that point, a young woman who had built, with the Compact's eventual cooperation, a genuine and considerable relationship with her Vesic heritage that existed comfortably alongside, rather than in competition with, her identity as Robert and Diane Foster's daughter. I think that's what everybody kind of missed during all those years of legal fighting. Nobody had to lose anything in the end. I got to keep my family, the people who actually raised me and loved me and showed up for every single hard day of my life, and I also got to eventually learn about my Vesic heritage, on my own terms, without anybody forcing me to pick one or the other like they were somehow incompatible. I think that's probably the actual lesson in all of this, if there is one. Family and heritage don't have to be a competition. Sometimes the healthiest thing is just letting a person hold both and trusting them to know, better than anyone else possibly could, where they actually belong. Robert Foster, reflecting years later on the extended legal battle that had, for 4 difficult years, threatened to permanently separate his family from a daughter they had never once considered anything less than fully theirs, offered a final reflection that would become, within subsequent human legal scholarship on cross-species custody cases, one of the most frequently cited encapsulations of the case's broader significance. People kept asking us during those years whether we were worried about losing her, he said. And honestly, We were terrified every single day in ways I don't think I've ever fully found the words to properly describe. But I remember telling Diane pretty early on that whatever happened with the legal case, nobody was ever going to be able to take away the 12 years we'd already had with her. Nobody could reach back in time and erase the fact that we were the ones who taught her to ride a bike and helped her with her homework and sat up with her during nightmares she couldn't always explain because they were about a crash she was too young to fully remember. Family isn't really a legal document when you get right down to it, whatever any court eventually decides. It's just showing up every single day for as long as it takes and choosing somebody over and over again, regardless of where they biologically came from. We chose Kessa the very first night she came into our home, terrified and alone, and unable to speak a word we understood. She chose us right back, eventually, once she was old enough to really understand what choosing actually meant. I don't think any court ruling or any diplomatic negotiation was ever really deciding anything that mattered more than that. They were just catching up, eventually, to something our family had already known for years.